Well, I want to welcome everybody to our special webinar in commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the September 11 attacks on the United States. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. We're an independent educational center located at Ashland University in Ohio. We run programs here at the university, but also around the country for students, teachers, and citizens on the history and principles of America and what those mean for contemporary issues of politics, government, and policy. So we thought it'd be a great opportunity for us today to take some of that thinking about America and apply it to what continues to be one of America's greatest challenges, the problem of national security and terrorism. The way we, of course, understand education here at Ashbrook is, as we always say, a conversation. We think of education as discovering the truth for yourself through conversation. So not just about information, and definitely not about indoctrination, but about that kind of give and take, that dialogue, that conversation that allows us to come to our own conclusions. And what could be more important, really, than coming to some important conclusions or having some important insights on a topic like this, which lives and breathes with us still after 20 years. And we're really delighted today to be joined in that conversation by Michael Hurley. Mike is president of Team 3I, a national security and international business strategy company. He is one of the nation's foremost experts in national security and terrorism. He has a long and deep resume of public service. He is a retired CIA officer who served around the world for over 25 years, including an 18-month deployment in Afghanistan in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Mike was on the ground. He's also senior counsel and team leader for the 9/11 Commission, which of course put out the very famous 9/11 Commission report, which I hope we'll talk about today. He also has particularly deep experience prior to his time in Afghanistan, working in Kosovo and Southeastern Europe, and also in tracking money laundering connected to drug trafficking. So Mike really has been involved in many aspects of American foreign policy and security policy. For over 3 decades, he has been on the front lines of keeping America safe and of thinking about what it takes to keep America safe. So Mike, I want to first of all just thank you for your service to our country, and also thank you for joining us.
Jeff, it's my pleasure to be with you and your audience. Thanks very much for those kind words.
Let me start with this as an opening question. As we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks tomorrow on September 11th, what lessons have we learned about fighting terrorism over the last 20 years? What are some of the most important in your mind?
Well, I think to answer that question, I just have to go back a little bit and look at, I think, some of the gaps or some of the weaknesses that we had before 9/11 in counterterrorism. And I think one of the big problems, and the 9/11 Commission focused on this, was there was often a failure among the agencies in the United States government charged with national security responsibilities to actually share information with each other. Now, that may sound like sort of a contradiction and kind of a really terrible situation to the American public. There were reasons for it, reasons growing out of legal reasons, for example. The FBI, for example, is a law enforcement agency, and so it was not an intelligence gathering sort of agency. And as a law enforcement agency, it's conducting criminal investigations and really can't share information because that would then corrupt prosecutions of criminals. And so that's like one reason. CIA was focused outward looking, and there were all these sorts of barriers, or I should say restrictions on how information and intelligence got shared, not only across government agencies, but also with state and local agencies in the United States government. And that's important because think we have something like 18,000 or 19,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States government, ranging from the massive New York Police Department, LAPD as well too, to sort of small agencies, departments in small rural counties that might only have a sheriff and a deputy sheriff. But there's a lot of trained law enforcement officers out there. We did not share very well intelligence with law enforcement from the federal government to state and local agencies. And so to some extent, what that means is you're not really taking advantage of all the experience and skills that you have out there. I'm not arguing that the federal government should share nuclear secrets with those kind of personnel, but you do want those people to be aware of a terrorist threat, for example. And I think in general, the American public, even law enforcement to some extent, was not really expecting certainly attacks within the United States from transnational terrorist groups. So to get back to your question, so I think we've become, to answer your question about what we've learned in counterterrorism in the 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, I think we've become much better at sharing information than we were before. And that's highly necessary. We're sharing it amongst our different agencies. The National Counterterrorist Center was set up as a federal government agency in order to promote that sharing of information. And then lots of new organizations, joint terrorism task forces that bring the FBI together in key cities with law enforcement, for example, even the private sector, designed to share information, fusion centers as well too, all to remedy that problem of having a good portion of professional law enforcement people kind of unaware of the threat that was out there. So I'd say that's a significant change and a positive one. I think we've also learned the limits of our counterterrorism capability as well too. And by that I mean, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, CIA ramped up very, very quickly after the 9/11 attacks. The director of the Counterterrorist Center at CIA briefed the president and the principal national security officials on the plan to go into Afghanistan within days of the 9/11 attacks. And the CIA was in the lead on that. And then within 2 weeks of the attacks, we actually had the first team on the ground in Afghanistan. And so we, I think, responded and ramped up in a way that few people expected that even CIA had that capability back then. So to me, they outperformed, they really did a stellar performance in those early days. And I think we were good as a government with CIA, with the military, at doing what we set out to do when there was a limited sort of set of priorities. And just to be frank, the priorities that the teams had that went into Afghanistan right at the beginning were to capture or kill Al-Qaeda, the people that had attacked, the groups that attacked the United States. That's what it was. And then to ensure that Afghanistan would not be a safe haven for terrorist groups in the future. And that was an important objective because of the fact that Al-Qaeda was using Afghanistan as a safe haven, they were able to conceive operations, plan operations, and train for operations in a place where they felt invulnerable. So we took that away from them in the early years. But I think one of the lessons that we've learned, certainly we should have learned, is that while we were good in those early days at achieving this narrow set of objectives, so we captured many Al-Qaeda, we killed many of them, and we made a lot of progress in that area. We ousted the Taliban government of Afghanistan that had really provided this congenial area for Al-Qaeda to train in for so long. But I think we tried to, go beyond that kind of counterterrorism mission in a way that, just from my perspective about from being on the ground in Afghanistan, like very soon after the 9/11 attacks, it just struck me very early on that if the U.S. government tried to engage in serious nation building there, that there was neither enough money nor resources nor attention span from the U.S. government to actually change Afghanistan in fundamental ways. And there's reasons for that we can go into, but I think that's a lesson. So I'm hoping that one of the lessons we learned, I don't know how to put this other than to say that I hope we're somewhat humbler in our approach to going into other countries. I fully believe and support that we went into Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. I think we had to do that. But when we start thinking that we can sort of change societies in fundamental ways, I think that's beyond even the capabilities of the United States. So I'm hoping that that's a lesson that we learned in counterterrorism.
If I can ask, and I want to invite our audience, of course, to also ask their questions and join us in the conversation by submitting those through the Q&A function. And if I can follow up on that, Mike, your time immediately on the ground in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, what impressions hit you about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and how organized Al-Qaeda was? Were they really a multinational, highly organized, centralized terrorist organization, or was it a loose collection of individuals?
I would describe it as a kind of a loose collection of groups that had some common interests, but differing interests as well too. So there was Al-Qaeda, there were the Arab fighters that were in Afghanistan, but there were also Uzbeks, extremist Uzbeks. There were the Uyghurs from China that participated as well too, extremists among those groups. So they had certain interests in common. And it was Al-Qaeda, I think, that conceived of attacking the United States. And it's always been an interesting thing for me because I think the United States became this sort of enemy of Al-Qaeda in a way for Al-Qaeda to demonstrate its strength within, or the importance of its movement within the Islamic world. I think for the last 40 or 50 years that there has been deep divisions in the Islamic world and Islamic civilization as it's tried to figure out how it would come to grips with modernization and globalization, and still maintain what it thought of as the principles of its civilization. And that's been a long-standing fight that's been going on. Al-Qaeda is one extremist group that realized that it could gain support and fame by directing its energy and its violence against the United States and against the West. So that was like one strong, I think, current in the enemy that we were facing in Afghanistan. There were other groups that united with them. I don't think it was that coherent, although when bin Laden was active, before he was killed, and before he fled Afghanistan, he was, he was the director, and there was a certain degree of unity of command, I would say, with Al-Qaeda. But if like a comparison with the U.S. military or some organization that's highly disciplined and has kind of deep institutional roots, I would not describe it that way because I don't think it had those characteristics.
Talk a little bit about your work, either on the ground in Afghanistan or outside of that, in counterterrorism activities with our allies. Who have been some of our most important allies over the last 20 years in the fight against terrorism, and how well have we worked with them?
Well, as a preface to getting into that, answering that question, and I should say that's another lesson. Going back to your first question, I think we've learned is to be even sharing intelligence better, not just with state and local and with our agencies of our own government, but with foreign governments, our allies as well too. And I think we're much better at that now than we were. But yes, so I was deployed to Afghanistan in early December 2001. I volunteered to go there on the day of 9/11. I walked down. I was at CIA headquarters in a completely different job responsibilities, but I walked to our counter-terrorist center and volunteered to go to Afghanistan. And it took them 2 to 2.5 months to get me out there. But when I hit the ground, so we were working with and we recruited a 1,500-man friendly Afghan militia. And that meant that we had to supply them with weapons, with ammunition, with food, with medicine, everything that a small army might need in order to sustain itself. So they became our allies. Local commanders became our allies. But we also had, to get to the heart of your question, deployed with us, and just from the US government, we were working with our elite special operations forces, with Delta Force. We had SEAL Team 6 deployed with us. We had Green Beret units, and then we had British Special Air Service, their equivalent of our Delta Force, more or less. British Special Boat Service, their equivalent of our US Navy SEALs. And we also had Australian Special Forces with us as well, too. So it was really, and they were joined very closely with us in terms of planning and working with us in these initially 7 outposts. We put small CIA teams with these allies into 7 strategic sort of compounds or outposts in Afghanistan, the strategic areas. And that capability, combined with US Air Force and air power, is really what led to us being so effective against Al Qaeda in the early days. But I think the cooperation was really fantastic amongst our allies. NATO invoked, I think, for the first time, its Article 5 provision, which essentially said an attack on one is an attack on all. So the United States was attacked, and there was this sort of great initial wave of support and tangible support, including commitment of military forces to assist the United States in Afghanistan. So that cooperation was at an apogee, I would say, in that first year through the second year in Afghanistan. And then as time went by, our allies took on specific assignments aside from just sort of the counterterrorism mission. But for example, I think the Germans were put in charge of building the Afghan and training the Afghan National Police Force. It was the US job to train the Afghan National Army, which we did, and equip it. I think the Italians were put in charge of reconstructing the judicial system, and so there was this sort of division of labor that was done, which made sense in a way. But again, sort of begging the question of whether over time this would all really, really work in a society that was so fragmented, and where loyalties really stem from family, clan, tribe, ethnic group, and even religious sect. And those loyalties always seem to me to predominate over any loyalties to a central government or democratic institutions.
I know you've spent time, as we said in the introduction, fighting international narcotics trafficking and money laundering. What have we learned, if anything, about terrorist financing and how to find and disrupt the financing of terrorists?
That's a very interesting question. So I think we've learned a lot. But at first, and people might be startled to know that when you look at the actual 9/11 operation of those 19 hijackers, that operation, I think the 9/11 Commission determined, costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $300,000. That is to pay for these guys when they lived in the United States for their travel to get here, and whatever it added up to, $300,000. Look at then the trillions of dollars that what they did, the consequences, just in dollar terms. Of course, the most important thing is the loss of life of 3,000 people on 9/11 itself, and the subsequent deaths of service people and agency people and State Department people all over the world from the conflicts that are going on. But that $300,000 expenditure led to massive, massive changes in our society. It led to 2 wars, and the consequences are just almost unimaginable. So I guess my point is we entered an age in which microfinancing almost could have macro unimaginable effects. But we became quite good at, when I say we, I mean the US government, CIA, Department of Homeland Security after it was created, a number of different agencies at tracking terrorist finances. This is one of the things that happen. Like typically, people ask where intelligence comes from. Well, one source of intelligence is when you capture somebody that's a known terrorist, even it's a low-level sort of terrorist in a terrorist organization. they often have cell phones with them. And so our intelligence agencies will get into those cell phones and they'll find a whole list of the contact numbers that these people have been in touch with. So then there's a quick investigations of who that may be. And you can track money flows that way. We started using big data analytics software, for example, to track money flows. And we would pick up information via the National Security Agency's intercepts of communications. All these different leads, and then a great deal of resources and personnel devoted to tracking terrorist finances. I think we got fairly good at it. It's never perfect, but it became clear, I think, to the U.S. government that finance and also terrorist travel as well, too, to the extent that they, had to travel on, public transport, on commercial airlines, for example, or whatever else, were points sometimes where they let their guard down and they could be tracked. I would also add to that early on their use of cell phones, for example, because in the early days in Afghanistan, and people remember stories of this, some of them would be out talking on their cell phones and suddenly they'd have a Hellfire missile come in on them, fired from a U.S. Air Force Predator drone flying overhead that they couldn't even see. And that's because we had the capability to track those phones. They became much smarter, and it was sort of sad when this happened, but I think it was the New York Times who disclosed in an article that the US was having this capability, and suddenly they got off their phones. And so they realized that that was a way to survive to the next day.
Yeah, that was a question I wanted to follow up with. In what ways in your time there in Afghanistan on the ground after 9/11, in what ways did you see groups like Al Qaeda adapting to the fight that was being brought against them by the US and our allies?
Well, that was definitely one of them. So staying off cell phones, that was a way that they adapted early on. The other thing is that they fled. They recognized that there was a superior, force that had come in. In recent books I've read about Osama bin Laden, and in which the authors have probed for years into documents that were left at that Abbottabad compound that he'd been living in Pakistan, that bin Laden was he was very, very worried about security, and very worried about changes that were taking place in Al Qaeda no longer being as prominent as it had been and being replaced by ISIS in Iraq and losing influence. So that was definitely one of the things I think where they adapted. And I think just kind of early on fleeing and fading into the hills and going into Pakistan and places where they would try to survive another day and then, regroup and continue mounting, in effect, guerrilla operations against NATO forces, against US forces and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And they were able to do this because there was almost a very compliant Pakistani intelligence agency that saw value in collaborating, isn't the right word, at least tacitly supporting the Taliban for reasons of its strategic reasons, all having to do with Pakistan's dread of India as its powerful neighbor and rival in the area. They always wanted Afghanistan to be fragmented to give them what's called strategic depth in Pakistan. And so they, at best turned a blind eye to Taliban's activities in Pakistan, their organizing, and kind of virtually allowing them to go cross the porous borders into Afghanistan, do great damage. So there was a lot of adapting into that sort of guerrilla, warfare form of fighting.
You've talked about some of the positive lessons that America has learned. In your experience, if you're willing to tell us, what do you think some of the biggest mistakes we made, not just early on, but over the last 20 years in the fight against groups like Al Qaeda?
I think that probably one of the mistakes we made early on, well, yeah, I'll look longer term as well, but early on, I think we were reliant too much on Pakistan to help us to stop them bleeding into Pakistan. And that may have been why we were not able to kill bin Laden when he was in the caves in Tora Bora in December of 2001. He escaped into Pakistan. I think with more Pakistani help there, we could have dealt with him 10 years before it actually happened. I think other mistakes that we made, again, as I said, I think we focused too much we focused too much on nation building in Afghanistan, and in a futile effort that I thought would never work. And I think a lot of the people on the ground there also believed it would never work. And it's sort of unfortunate because I'm not sure that that message ever really got, or it didn't resonate with policymakers here. So that was that. And it's, I also would sort of say that we, to some extent, took our attention off of Afghanistan as well when we went into Iraq, which was deemed as the bigger problem in 2003, 2004, 2005. As a result, resources and personnel got funneled there. And I think we lost some momentum in Afghanistan. And just I think also the whole question of trying to have an understanding of how big a threat Al-Qaeda was as time went by. And I just was talking to a colleague of mine from the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow was the executive director of it. He thinks a lot about these issues. And he makes the point that it's really hard for for US president or an administration to what he calls right size the threat, to have an understanding of the actual threat. Because if you underestimate what the threat is and something bad happens, you're toast as a political leader. Same with a military leader. If you haven't, taken every single possible measure you can take to prevent some sort of terrorist attack and something happens, even if it's completely out of control or unforeseen, you're still going to get blamed for it. And so consequently, there is a tendency, I think, to enlarge the threat, beyond what it actually may be. And that can be crippling in its own right, but there's this fear of underestimating it that could have terrible consequences for the country. So I think that's one of the negative things too. And I'm not sure, I don't have an answer for that. I don't have a good answer for that as to how do you accurately assess what the threat is. And this was really the problem before 9/11, because there were so many attacks by Al-Qaeda that were picking away at us in different parts of the world. The simultaneous attacks on two embassies in East Africa, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in August 1998, in which 12 Americans were killed, and thousands of Africans wounded in those attacks. We knew that was Al-Qaeda. That was an Al-Qaeda operation. Later, there was the attack on the USS Cole, a US Navy war vessel off the coast of Yemen, in which 41 sailors were killed, and there was $500 million of damage done to that. Those were acts of war. But I think, all told, I may have this wrong, but I think there were probably less than 70 or 80 Americans that had been killed by Al-Qaeda before 9/11. So if you're a policymaker and you're looking at this and you're trying to decide where does this fit in terms of a threat to the United States, as opposed or as compared with, North Korea and Iran and nuclear, foes, for example, and all the other things that are out there. Do you say this should be at the top of the list of, and that we should commit all U.S. capabilities to eradicating it? Or do you say that, yes, this is serious and we have to, take certain actions, but we have all these other massive things to deal with too? It's a tough problem, and it's easy to criticize those who, in retrospect, seem to have gotten it wrong. But I don't think it has an easy solution.
If we can, we're getting some really great questions in from our audience, and a lot of them are interested naturally in the current situation and in your assessment of future threats. And in particular, we've got one question. You were on the ground in Afghanistan. You've alluded to this already about the training of the Afghans and their connection or lack of connection to a kind of cohesive national government, nation, and the problem of nation building. But one of our audience is your opinion. Were you surprised at the speed of the recent collapse of the Afghan military and government?
I have to say, it's a good question. I have to say, I was not surprised, and I can actually sort of back this up because I was when President Biden, well, first when President Bush, I'm sorry, President Trump at the time said that he was going to follow a policy of getting us out of Afghanistan, and then President Biden, when he came in, basically kept the same idea. It's something that he had believed in for a long time, even since the time he was in the Senate, and certainly through the years he was vice president. I can remember when I think he announced in April, that is President Biden, that we'd be pulling out all our forces. And I forget, initially he was talking about an end date of this September. But I remember exchanging emails with friends who asked me, what do you think about this? How long will it take until the Taliban takes over the country? And I said, about 2 or 3 weeks is what I said at the time. So I personally wasn't surprised. What surprised me was how I think this administration was caught, in my judgment, flat-footed by the speed in which it collapsed. The reason I wasn't surprised was I think it goes back to this view that I had that in the people that I dealt with, they just did not feel a deep connection to Kabul. The Afghans I dealt with, they felt a deep connection in their own regions. That's where they looked for protection and, sort of sustenance and, anything that having to do with security. They didn't look to the central government. So I thought the institutions there, the democratic institutions, were built on shaky ground, kind of imposed rather than having kind of grown up organically in Afghani soil. So for me, it didn't surprise me, but I would have expected that. And I think so many of our veterans, our military people who had served in Afghanistan, I don't think they were surprised by the speed it happened. I think it comes down more to being surprised by how our government appeared initially not to be ready for this speed of the collapse.
What do we know about the new Taliban regime?
Well, we know quite a lot about Barreder, who is the, I guess, the effective leader. He was a close, I think he was a top lieutenant of Mullah Omar, the previous Taliban leader on back in 2001. He's a hardcore sort of Islamist who I expect is deeply committed to the Taliban principles that governed the country before the 9/11 attacks, which was a society in which a misogynistic society in which women really had no role, undemocratic, obviously, using very brutal means to enforce adherence to the strictest interpretation of Islamic law. I mean, I think that we may well have listeners to this discussion that know much more about Islamic society than I do. But I would just say that for most Americans that haven't studied South Asia or the Islamic world in general, and the Arab world, that we don't have a deep understanding of how deeply intertwined governments are in those countries, in those Islamic countries, with religion. They don't separate religion and government the way we do in the United States. Here, it's a fundamental principle of our sort of constitutional arrangement, and a deep belief here that there's freedom of religion, and that the government, there would be no established religion in this country. In those countries, it's completely different. They're governed by adherence to the Quran and to Islamic law, and so that is what I think is going to characterize the Taliban. I've been seeing, like everybody else recently, all kinds of reporting in the open press that they will be more moderate, and there certainly will be forces to try to, sort of try to push them in the direction of being somewhat more moderate. After all, they have to operate in the modern world. They have neighboring countries. They live in a very dangerous neighborhood with, I would almost say, predatory countries around them, like Iran, like China, and Pakistan, who will not be interested in the welfare of Afghanistan so much as their own national interest. So I think that, I don't know, I can't sit here today and say that their government will be draconian, but I do expect it to be kind of aggressively promoting, Islamic governance that is, kind of adherence to Islamic law. And so I think we may see kind of going backwards to where women are not allowed to participate in any way, for example. Girls are, and that was one thing that struck me. I think it's hard for us as Americans to get our heads around this, but literally when I went to Afghanistan in 2001, during the previous period when the Taliban had been the ruling authority in Afghanistan, girls were not allowed to go to school. There was a policy to keep girls illiterate, to not learn how to read, and to be uneducated. And I've always looked at that policy and sort of say, well, that basically means you're not going to be taking advantage of, the talents of 50% of the population, more than 50%. And so will they come to grips and with just the realities of the modern world or not? I don't know. I do fear that it will continue to be, it may develop somewhat back into a safe haven for terrorists, because I think ISIS is active there. There's ISIS-K as well that's active there. And there is enmity between the Taliban and some of these other groups. So I'm not saying it's sort of a monolithic sort of evil force there, but there's going to be a lot of contention going on for quite a long time. And so I expect that government to, they're going to have to exist, and they're going to need financial support. A lot of reporting lately that China is going to move in very quickly, as it's been trying to do in many parts of the world, be very aggressive to build dependencies there, and they'll shower them with money and build infrastructure. But that will be done at a price that the government there may not be willing to pay over time. So I don't have a clear crystal ball on it, but I do think it's a region that we're going to have to pay very, very close attention to. And someone else was telling me recently, I thought it was a really interesting point, that we like to think of, a start to a war being in a war and an end to the war. Now, after 20 years, so, it sort of seems like one of the themes out there is that the war is over for the United States. I'm not so sure about that. It doesn't mean that that's going to be an area, South Asia, that doesn't pose a threat to us, and new threats will develop there and elsewhere. And I think that we, it may require all sorts of responses that we can't quite yet foresee.
Well, that actually goes to a question from the audience that we have right along these lines, which is, should Americans be concerned, and you alluded to this briefly, but should Americans be concerned with the possibility of an alliance between China and the new Taliban government? And what does the complicated geopolitics of that region mean for continued U.S. involvement in that area of South Asia?
It is, when I speak to recently retired senior people who are senior admirals in the Navy, generals in the Air Force, in the Army, what I learn is that the Pentagon sees the biggest threat to the United States in the future as China, and that is what really most of the wargaming now is focused on, and being prepared for the threat of a resurgent and powerful China. That even many people are saying that the 21st century is going to be the century of China as the dominant power eventually. And so China is asserting itself all over the world. And I think in particular, they will want to step into this somewhat of a vacuum that's now in Afghanistan and South Asia. I don't, that it doesn't necessarily have to be directly contrary to US interests. I haven't seen reporting on this today, but I understand President Biden had a call last night with Xi Jinping, and I'm sure Afghanistan was on the topic list. I don't know if we'll get a readout of all the details or what exactly they went into, but I could see a number of different scenarios where China's influence there and elsewhere, we're going to be rubbing up against each other in our interests into the indefinite future. And I think it's going to be how all of that is managed by our leadership and the Chinese leadership that will define the world that we'll see in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when we think sometimes of the threat of China, we think of the South China Sea, we think of Taiwan, we think of their force projections in Southeast Asia. We don't always think of the possibilities for Chinese influence spreading in Central and South Asia.
Yes, so it's spreading in Central and South Asia. It's spreading certainly into Africa. China has been buying land and financing agriculture, and they face. I think they're very forward-looking as they think about climate change and about being able to feed their massive population in the coming decades as well too. So establishing these relationships and they have money now and using that money and that power. And I think they somewhat see the U.S. in retreat around the world, and they're going to step in wherever possible because they'd like to be making the rules and kind of be the force behind the international system. And I'm not sure that's a system that will be very congenial to the United States if it comes to pass.
Talk a little bit about the future. You've alluded to China as one element of emerging threats in the future, but this is something you've also thought a lot about, I know. What do you see as sort of the top emerging threats in the next decade for the United States?
Well, terrorism is still certainly a problem, and I like to grapple with this problem of right-sizing it as to how big a problem it is and what the priority should be in dealing with it. But so let's keep that on the table. But I also think that, and we discussed China already, but building on that a little bit, I think war is moving very much into I guess what used to be called outer space, into space. Weapons are becoming so sophisticated now. We are so dependent as a society on satellites, and we're putting up thousands of satellites. Commercial entities are putting up thousands of satellites. Just in the next 5 to 10 years, I think there'll be another 30,000 satellites, and some of these are very small that are put up for telecommunications and all the other things that we're dependent on. And China is the country that's developing the capabilities, and we have these capabilities to take out those satellites or to interfere with all these telecommunication systems that we've set up and so on. So I suspect that if we get into a shooting war, it's going to kind of verge into areas that haven't happened before. So that's a big threat, I think. I think that that cyber attacks, Russia seems to be the mastermind in some ways. At least the Russian government, Putin seems to be giving a free hand to the very capable hackers that exist in Russia, and they're kind of sort of low-ranking criminals in a way, but they have capabilities in cyber, and we've seen with SolarWinds and some of these other attacks on the U.S. That they can cause a lot of damage. We have not yet experienced a cyber Pearl Harbor, to put it in those terms, but there may be one coming. I know a little something about U.S. capabilities and offensive cyber capabilities, and they're very, very potent. I can only assume that China has similar capabilities, almost anyway. And we're reluctant to use those because if you use those, again, how do you frame a cyber attack on us? How big of an attack is it? How do you frame a response to that? Because if you go overboard, there are powers out there, probably including Russia and China, that can shut our infrastructure down with the flip of a switch, and things like that. So that's a big problem. But cyber in general, I think it's been known for the last decade that the Chinese through hacking and through sort of cyber intelligence have broken into so many systems and gotten so many sort of secret plans and secret designs and technology from the United States that some of our former directors of the National Security Agency, who are well aware of this, have said that what China has been doing over the last half dozen years or so amounts to the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. And that's wealth going, intellectual property going from the United States to China, and they're ruthless about it. So that's a huge threat as well, too. I'd add to the list, as we're experiencing now, pandemics, which, people have been warning, experts have been warning for a long time that we're going to see more and more of this because of the destruction of natural habitats. Animals are living closer to human beings. Viruses jump from animals to human populations, and that there may be some really nasty stuff that will be coming our way beyond COVID in the years ahead. So that's a huge threat, and how the world responds to it, I think, is going to be really, really important. Climate has to probably enter into this at some point as well, too, just looking at what's happening around the world in terms of wildfires and hurricanes and so on and so forth. The big question is, I know it's a political question, but really what can be done about it, and what's the cost of that, and what are the trade-offs that happen with all of that. So, but I do think that's on the table in terms of threats that are out there as well, too. And then, of course, you always have to worry about chemical and biological threats from countries that are adversary countries, and nuclear threats as well, too. So there's no shortage of threats that we face in the future.
That's a sobering assessment. But if the question from an audience audience member here is a really good one. Given those emerging threats of China, of space, of cyber attacks, pandemics, the intellectual property theft, all of what you've talked about, their question is, does the current U.S. national security apparatus meet the needs of national security in light of those emerging threats? And if not, what would you change about our national security apparatus?
Oh, but that's a really, really good question. And I think in some ways that it does, although I would say that, and one of the lessons I learned on the 9/11 Commission is that we always have to be open to evolving, and maybe evolving isn't the right word because that implies kind of a slow process, but changing quickly in response to new threats that appear on the horizon, and thinking in advance of what those new threats might be in order to be organized and have the policies in place that can deal with them. To some extent, our national security system is a cumbersome process. There's reasons for that, and you want issues thought out, sort of soberly, and people to reflect on things and analyze things and come up with the best solutions. We're not such a top-down, someone gives an order and changes things immediately. There often has to be consensus developed among experts, and then decisions are made. So people wonder, for example, one of the changes following the 9/11 attacks was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. I think in some ways, and that united, 19 separate government agencies into one big agency that has a couple 100,000, 250,000 people working for it, and a massive budget. I think that there are pluses that Department of Homeland Security has produced. I think there's probably many people that complain about it as well too, to sort of say that it may be ineffective in certain areas. So you make these changes, and I think you have to be willing to continue to constantly evaluate them and to see, are they performing the way you want them to be performing? Are they improving our security, or do they need to be changed? And I think we should never stay wedded to an idea that we've had that seemed good at the time, but then sort of empirical evidence shows that it's not performing the way that it should be. So we created commands. We created a cyber command in the military because of the cyber threat, for example. Are we as nimble as we should be? Probably not. I would say, like, one of the best things we can do is, the more we can, in my view, the more we can foster communication between the private sector and government, the better off that we're going to be. And in part, I think 85 to 90% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is owned by the private sector. Most of the brain power is in the private sector. There's good brain power in the government too about that, but you need to have systems in place where the private sector and the government, and yeah, there are reasons that make it difficult. There's all kinds of reasons. We're a society where, you know, sort of restrictions and legalities are, you know, in place for very important reasons. But still, I think the more we can have the private sector working in concert with the government, it's going to make us safer longer term. We're going to be able to adapt better to the threats that we face. And that was something that was, I think, really lacking before the 11 attacks as well too. So I think reforms I guess it would come down to, Jeff, fostering an attitude and approach in the government where the government is always sort of open to thinking about what the future may bring, and where people that have that kind of innovative and imaginative thinking and creative thinking are operating in a system where they're rewarded for, or that's valued, let's say, for you know, coming up with ideas or changes in ways that make us safer. And I think that's the fundamental thing that we have to have to help, you know, promote national security.
Right. That seems to be a common theme of folks who have been on the ground and lived in that experience, the danger and problem of the bureaucratization of national security thinking and activities. Can I ask you a little bit, your time in the Central Intelligence Agency and your time in Afghanistan with the CIA and American military personnel. As we close here, talk a little bit about the character of the human beings that you worked with in the CIA and the United States military. What kind of people were they? What impressed you about them?
Well, thanks for that question. I think that I think there's some extraordinary people that work in the United States government overall, and I have to say, I get. This is just a personal thing, but you know, when people get very negative about what's, you know, become known as the deep state, I mean, to me, the deep state are the people at CIA that volunteered to go to Afghanistan. You know, people committed government servants and civil servants, and our military as well too. And I think that's an important thing to note, because it speaks, I think, to the quality of the people that we have. And I make these points to any of the students that may be listening to this, that the government really needs talented young people kind of flowing into these agencies. I mean, we can sit on the sidelines and we can criticize, or we can get involved and try to make institutions better. And I think young people bring energy, they bring their educations, they bring their backgrounds and ethics and integrity to these jobs. And I think they can really have an impact. In CIA, it's probably not generally known, but it's unlike the military, where in the military, if your unit is ordered to go overseas, to deploy to someplace, some dangerous area, you go. In CIA, it's all voluntary. Everyone that went to Afghanistan volunteered to go there. And to me, that's kind of a mark of, you know, people that are kind of stepping up. They're committed professionals. I met some really, really remarkable people that have abilities in 5 or 6 languages. They speak them fluently, that have studied the history and cultures of parts of the world that are not, you know, immediately accessible or well understood by most Americans, let's say. And those capabilities are really important when we're in a jam as a country, and you have to have people that can essentially be dropped into very dangerous areas and that can function and do positive things and get their gears turning. I'll tell you one story of, it's a personal story, but we had a young man who was a graduate of Harvard Law School, and he got a job with a major law firm in Washington, D.C., and was, I guess, as we say, sort of set for life in a way, you know, to become a prominent lawyer and probably a wealthy lawyer. And a couple of years after starting to practice law, he was watching what was happening in the world. He saw the attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa in 1998. He saw the attacks on the USS Cole in October 2000, and he sort of thought that he wanted to be directly involved in responding to some of these things. So he applied to CIA, kind of stepping out of a very lucrative career path to one that was quite a bit different from that. And CIA, in its wisdom, accepted him, and he went through training, and so he was part of the first graduating class of trainees as operations officers to graduate from all of that training post 9/11. So sometime in fall of 2001, he completed his training. And then he was one of these volunteers I was speaking about. He raised his hand right away to go to Afghanistan, and they assigned him to the area where I was commander in a very remote and dangerous part of Afghanistan in southeastern Afghanistan. And he arrived in early 2002, and he was just a remarkable young guy, 27, 28 years old at the time, and he did extraordinary work. He did not have a military background. He did have an interest in military affairs, and he was a trained paramilitary through CIA training, and he just did this great job. I mean, I don't know what in his background, prepared him for being a quartermaster of instructor for planner, strategist for a 1,500 person friendly Afghan force of people that were soldiers that were helping us, and to do all those sorts of things and to collect intelligence on the ground in perhaps the most dangerous part of the world. But he did it with great distinction. And I had the sense, as I got to know him, and we had many conversations, that I was looking at somebody who would not only be a future senior leader at CIA, but probably in national security writ large in the US government. And there was, given his background and his education and his skills, I just thought that he just had a brilliant future in front of him. And he went back to headquarters after 4 months in Afghanistan, volunteered to go back to Afghanistan after that, which he did. And 2 or 3 days after arriving, he was killed. And for me, it was, we've suffered, Jeff, so many losses in this 20 years, not just in Afghanistan, but in Iraq and around the world. Sacrifices of many young people being killed, many being wounded, and it has taken such a great toll. When you know somebody personally and you have that sense of loss, and you know who they were, and not only who they were, but you had a pretty good sense of who they were becoming and their quality and so on. It just was a tremendous loss, and I realized that the country had lost, somebody. But I think he was a really good example of the kind of people that we had and we have all over the government, not just in CIA, but I look at what our State Department's Foreign Service officers, our diplomats do, which is an extraordinary career for any young person who wants to be out representing their government overseas, often now in hardship areas. And I will tell you, anybody who's listening, that we need good people. They're challenging careers. It would be the type of career, if you're in the Foreign Service, if you're working for the U.S. Agency for International Development or CIA, no day will be the same as the day before, and you will have challenges and projects and things that you get involved with that will have a direct impact on the security of the country, and the work that you do will be seen and will be appreciated by the highest levels of the United States government. It's I think the qualities of some of these people that have been out doing these things, I really take my hat off to them. And for the younger generation now, and anybody who may be listening that has moved to get into a career like this, well, I'll be cheering you on in the years ahead, you will have a most extraordinary time.
Well, that's a true testament to the character and sacrifice of those, and we shouldn't forget that on this 20th anniversary of 9/11. Mike, thank you for so much for taking the time to share your experience, your thoughts, your insight with us. Really valuable and very moving. Thank you for that.
Jeff, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
And I just want to thank everyone else out there who's joining us. You for being in the conversation with us, for all your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we didn't have the time to get to all of them, but we really do appreciate you joining us as always. Our next in-person event will be a lecture on Constitution Day, where we'll honor a founding document of this country with Ohio's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Maureen O'Connor. And of course, a link to a recording of this webinar will be sent to all of you. Please listen to it again. Send it to your friends, send it to your family, send it to your children, grandchildren, those who you know who have an interest in America's national security, America's future, and to the kind of call to public service that Mike gave to young people today. We really want this to go far and wide to all those out there. If you want to know more about the Ashbrook Center, please look us up at ashbrook.org to find out about our mission to educate Americans in our history and founding principles. Thank you again for this conversation. We really believe that thinking about these fundamental issues of national security policy in light of America's history, principles, and the character of the American people can help us renew our own understanding of what it means to be an American. And that understanding always gives us hope. So on this commemoration of 9/11 and a sober time, let's also let it be a hopeful time. Thank you all for joining us. And as always, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you very much.